Welcome to this Socialist Workers' Party Facebook Live meeting on COVID-19, capitalism and economic crisis. My name's Sophia Beach. I'm going to be chairing this meeting this evening, and we've got two really brilliant speakers which I'm going to introduce in just 1 second. Firstly, a little few announcements for us. You can comment throughout the meeting in the Facebook comments below as you're streaming live. Please ask questions for the speakers as they're giving their presentations, and please share the stream widely so we can reach as wide an audience as possible. You can also tweet the stream at the hashtag Health Before Profit, and also both speakers have got books that are available on Bookmark's bookshop website, which are still doing deliveries. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce both speakers before I bring in our first. We've got Joseph Choonara, who is the editor of the International Socialism Journal and also author of A Reader's Guide to Capital. And we've also got Michael Roberts, who's a Marxist economist, and he's an author of several books. You can see two of them in his background screen, one of them being The Long Depression. So without further ado, both speakers are going to speak for roughly 15 minutes, and then we're going to have a round of questions, a couple round of questions, so please keep commenting throughout. So over to you, Joseph.
Thanks, Sophia. Let me just get my PowerPoint up and running. I think one of the things I want to start with is that it's very tempting to see the COVID-19 outbreak as some sort of natural disaster, some sort of act of God, impacting on capitalism from the outside. I want to argue that contrary to that, we can only understand this as a pandemic that to a large extent originates from capitalism and is shaped by a capitalist context. If you look at the really big pandemic threats today, these come primarily from novel viruses, influenza, coronaviruses like the current one are the most obvious. And these threats tend to spill over as mutated viruses that come from reservoirs of animals. And the processes by which these enter human society are heavily shaped by capitalism as a system. And there's two main routes that this takes. And here I'm drawing very much on the writings of Rob Wallace, who writes in the Monthly Review and elsewhere, and a number of the Marxist writers who talk about the relationship between capital and the natural world. Now, the first route is the route from agribusiness. And if you look at the recent strains of pandemic flu, H1N1, H5N1, and so on, this is where they've tended to originate. What mass industrial production of animals does is it puts pigs or chickens in conditions where animals are packed together in huge numbers, are stressed, are immunosuppressed because of that stress and the conditions they live under, and in which they're placed in close contact with humans. And this creates huge reservoirs from which viruses can spill out into society more generally. Not only that, but one of the points that Rob Wallace makes is that these capitalist production systems tend to select for the most deadly forms of virus. Normally, a virus will want to keep its host alive as long as possible, so it has the greatest chance of spreading. But if you create a system where the goal is to raise an animal to maturity as fast as is humanly possible, and then kill it and put it on a plate, then the virus has no incentive to keep the animal alive. In other words, you're selecting for the deadliest strains of virus. Moreover, you're selecting for the strains of virus that can leap most readily from host to host. So these very virulent strains tend to emerge in the context of capitalist agriculture. And it's very clear that it's only a matter of time before we see another major pandemic outbreak emerging from these kind of locations. The second route that we can talk about through which these viruses enter human populations is not so much directly through capitalist agriculture as through the incursion of capitalist agriculture and production into the wilderness. As capitalist production and capitalist agriculture push into wild areas and increasingly commodify nature, what they do is they disrupt delicate ecosystems push animal species together and draw these pathogens into contact with human populations by commodifying nature. To give you one example, if you look at the emergence of the Ebola pandemic in West Africa, this was driven largely by a land grab that took place in West Africa by Western multinationals to create major palm oil plantations. This disrupted the ecological system for bats, which are the main reservoir species for Ebola. The bats came into these palm oil plantations to seek shelter, food, and so on, and were drawn into contact with humans. And this is felt to be the place at which the Ebola pandemic originated. Something very similar seems to have happened with the COVID-19 outbreak. Coronaviruses circulate naturally in the wild among bat populations, and through some sort of intermediate species, as the natural environment has been commodified, it's drawn into contact with humans, and from China radiates out through these capitalist circuits. Now, not only is it the case that capitalist production and agriculture generates these pandemic threats, but it shapes the response from ruling classes to the pandemic outbreaks. In most cases, the first response of the capitalist class and the ruling class around the world has been complacency. In other words, keep the wheels of capitalism running, keep the processes of profit making going, don't shut workplaces, and so on and so forth. This is why even today, Donald Trump in America downplays the threat from this coronavirus. In Britain too, we saw in the early weeks of the year, the only real advice from the government is to wash your hands. These are weeks and months where the government could have been preparing testing, building respirators, doing things to slow the spread of the disease. Even more disastrously, when they turn to doing something about the outbreak, they talk in terms of herd immunity, a disastrous strategy of keeping businesses running, keeping normal society functioning, and allowing the disease to spread through human populations. It was only when it's pointed out to them that 250,000 or 500,000 people could die, and the whole NHS, which as we know has been drastically underfunded in recent years, could come crashing down, that they're forced into more drastic action. And one by one, we've seen governments around the world forced to move from complacency to top-down and often quite authoritarian measures to try to control the situation. But even when they do this, they're shaped by capitalist prerogatives. If you look at Italy, for example, large numbers of businesses that were in no way essential were kept running as the pandemic spread. And it took major action by groups of workers in textiles and steel, in the ports and so on, who took matters into their own hands and took strike action to actually close these businesses. In other words, if you look at the response to a crisis, at every level, you face a choice between profitability and saving people's lives, between capitalist interests and working class interests. The third point I want to make is about the broader economic impact of this crisis. It is very, very clear now that a major recession is underway across the capitalist system. Now, one of the things this pandemic reveals that the thing that actually makes capitalism function is not the genius of entrepreneurs like Richard Branson, it's not the workings of the financial markets in the City of London. At the most basic level, it's a labor of ordinary human beings, as Marx pointed out hundreds of years ago. And the kind of disruption to these human productive processes at any point in history, in the history of capitalism, would spark a crisis. But the point I want to make is that this crisis now risks turning into a major slump for the capitalist system, possibly on a larger scale than in 2008, 2009. The reasons for this, Michael Roberts is going to say a lot more about this, but I want to say that one of the points that we both very strongly agree with is that the 2008-2009 crisis was a product of a long period of subdued profitability across the core of the capitalist system. And that low profitability was concealed by a series of financial bubbles, and underlying them, a mega bubble of credit, which drove the capitalist system forwards year after year. And it's that process of debt-led expansion that caused the system ultimately to come crashing down in 2008 and 2009. Now, in theory, that crisis of the system ought to have destroyed unprofitable firms, paving the way for a rebound in profitability. But in practice, what happens in 2008, 2009 was that states, central banks stepped in through stimulus packages, through slashing interest rates, for engaging in quantitative easing and so on, to drive the system out of its crisis, out of its recession. What this meant, and it's very important to say that this new normal that they introduced of ultra low interest rates, quantitative easing and so on, hasn't been something that they've managed to fully break with. We're still living in the with the after effects of 2008, 2009. So what this did was to keep the system alive, but because profitability remained low, it didn't generate much increase in productive investment or rises in productivity. Instead, what you saw across the capitalist system is a wave of speculative activity, boosting share prices and creating new bubbles. Even more importantly, what you saw was a rise of more and more what we call zombie firms. These are firms kept alive by cheap credit, able to keep ticking over because interest rates are so low, but incapable of producing any real economic dynamism. And these have made the capitalist system extraordinarily vulnerable to another downturn. This is why we're facing a potential slump. And as Michael Roberts has been warning us for many, many years now, the system was long overdue a crisis. The final point I want to make is just briefly to sum up by talking about the implications for socialists. I think if you look at the response to this double crisis, the initial response of ruling classes around the world was to repeat what they did in 2008, 2009, to further slash interest rates, to unleash new quantitative easing, in the case of the Federal Reserve, to unleash a wave of dollars into global markets and so on. But because interest rates are already extremely low, and because the impact of these measures is quite limited in terms of what it can achieve, states turn more and more to direct bailouts of the economy. In other words, they're socializing areas of production. If you look at the stimulus package in America, the $2 trillion package that they're offering is already bigger than the package across the entire G20 back in 2008, 2009. And this means partial nationalizations. It means directly paying wages in some cases. It means putting cash into people's bank accounts in the US and so on. And some of these things are absolutely preposterous. A few days ago, the government said that within a week, local councils have to host the entire homeless population. Why couldn't they have done that in normal times? And the point I want to make by conclusion is that what we're seeing is a system of capitalism for us, but socialism for the bosses. In the Telegraph, Ambrose Pritchard Evans talks about introducing socialism to save capitalism. The very obvious point we should be making in this context is if socialism is needed to rescue us from the coronavirus, surely we should be talking not about socialism to rescue capitalism, but a long-term rethinking of the very structures of capitalist production, which have produced so much horror, which generate these pandemic diseases, but create other horrors on a global scale of exploitation, oppression, climate change, ecological destruction, and so on. In other words, what we're seeing is a return to the familiar question of socialism or barbarism. But I think what the disease outbreak has shown is that choice between socialism and barbarism is becoming more urgent than ever before. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much for that, Joseph. That was very clear and concise. Just quickly before I bring our second speaker, Michael, in, I'd like to say that I can already see there's been plenty of comments coming out on the comments section below, so please keep them coming in. After Michael's done his introduction, we'll be able to hear from both speakers again regarding your questions. And I'd also briefly like to say that apologies in advance for any technical difficulties. We're trying our best, obviously, in these times. Everybody's learning things very quickly. This is only the second Facebook live stream that we've done, but it's the first one we've hosted via Zoom, so I hope that everything's running smoothly for everybody else. But without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce our second speaker, Michael Roberts, who, as I said before, is an author and an economist. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Sophie. It's a pleasure to take the opportunity to do this online conference or discussion. I think we'll be doing a lot more of these by the look of it, given the fact that we're locked down for who knows how long, and we are all beginning to learn how to process this new way of trying to communicate rather than physically. And as I'm rather of an ancient age, of course, I am locked up and shielded in a far point of southern England in order to avoid the impact of the virus. But other people are already taking a hit in terms of their health and so on. But above all, we're looking forward what's going to happen to the economy. And that's what I really want to discuss if I can. Okay, so here's a little discussion around a few graphs. I want to deal mainly, Joseph explained very clearly the way in which the virus that we've been hit with now is not something out of the blue. It's not something like an asteroid from the sky. It's a product of the whole process of the capitalist exploitation of agriculture and of also the increasing industrialization and commodification of animals and nature in general. But the other reason that we have this slump now is also to do with capitalism itself, which Joseph touched on, and I'd like to develop. We're in a huge lockdown and slump in a whole range of countries now. According to the figures I have at the moment, there's 1.7 billion people across the world now living under some form of lockdown as a result of this virus. That's a quarter of the world's population. And that data doesn't include India, which is supposed to be locking down and would take us up to 3 billion. But of course, lockdown in India is much harder to achieve than being said. But we can see that this is unprecedented, to use the word that the media uses all the time now, the state of a lockdown or closing down of production across the world in some of the most important countries. And the world economy really has seen nothing like this. Nearly all the economic forecasts now for this year are for a contraction of world GDP by something like 3 to 5% from where it was at the beginning of 2020. That's worse, or at least as bad as the Great Recession of 2008-9. And in lockdowns, according to the OECD just this week, output in most economies will fall by 25%. So if you've got a month's worth of lockdowns, the economy will be down by 25% on average, maybe up to 1/3. So each month, there will be a reduction in annual GDP of something like 2 percentage points. So if a lockdown lasted for a year, that's how you'd end up with a 25% fall in output in the major economies. Obviously, the hope is from governments and everybody else for that matter that the lockdown will not last that long. But you can see that if it did last a year, these are the sorts of falls in GDP that you can expect across the major economies. Anything from 20% in China to well over 25, 30% in Spain. And if you want to take the US, the most important economy, 25% if we have a 12-month lockdown. Now, would we have a 12-month lockdown? Well, here's the state of the pandemics in a sort of schematic way at the moment, the evolution of the current pandemic. We can see that if we go towards the middle block of that I've isolated there, we're heading towards a peak in the case of Italy and Spain, at least according to the latest figures. But we're already slowing down in terms of the increase in the number of infections and cases in South Korea and China. But some of the big countries in Europe and including the US have still a long way to go to their peak. China is going to end the Wuhan lockdown officially on the 8th of April, which means something like 50 days worth of lockdown has taken place in Wuhan. Now, if everybody repeats China's length of lockdown, and that's a big assumption because some people have not done it nearly as successfully as China has done once it got going, we're going to have a 50-day lockdown in all those countries. And I don't know position in your country if you're not in the UK, but in the UK we've only had a week of lockdown, and we're proposing, this is proposed to be ended after 3 weeks, but you can see that is way short of what will probably be necessary in order to turn that peak up there downwards in the direction where South Korea and China are. So we've probably got at least 2 months of lockdown and a reduction in GDP output, and above all, in people's jobs and incomes over the next couple of months, at least, if not more, right through to the end of the year. I just want to repeat what Joseph said. What brings home to you when you do a lockdown is that you're locking down output. You're sending people home. They're no longer working, whether they work for a company or whether they work for themselves. And there's a huge reduction in output, but also in basic value. Surprise, surprise, but billionaires do not create profits. Billionaires do not create value. Companies don't create value. People do. People going to work do. And as Marx said well over 150 years ago, every child knows a nation which ceased to work, and I will not say they work for a year, but even for a few weeks would perish. And that's the position that we now face over the next couple of months or so. And here is the very latest figure we've got for US unemployment at last week, the third week of March up to 22 March. We had 282,000 people applying for benefit because they didn't have a job in the March 15th week in the US, and now that has gone to 3.3 million workers claiming benefit for a job. And tomorrow, or next week, next Friday, we shall get the figures on unemployment, which are going to see really horrific. US unemployment and many other countries of unemployment, official unemployment rates as low as 3%, world, if you're all-time lows. That figure is going to double and triple over the next few weeks and months as we go into 2020. And large numbers of people are going to be without employment and unable to maintain their businesses as such. In the UK, for example, just in the last 10 days, universal credit, for those who aren't in the UK, this is a way of bumping up people's very low pay through reducing their credit, increasing their credits and reducing their tax. Claims to that have risen to 500,000. That's a massive jump. And it suggests that 2 million people have already lost their job and are being forced to claim this credit in the UK. The recession is already here in the UK. The International Labour Organization have made a first estimate of what this means globally. They estimate a massive increase in global unemployment of something like 20 to 25% over the next 3 quarters of 2020 if this lockdown continues, and even as it is at the moment at this level. And that means something like losing nearly 3.4 trillion on the worst case of income for the billions across the world. All those people in the so-called emerging markets already at poverty levels face a massive reduction in their incomes. And yet they're still trying to work. We're talking about people who were at work before, not people living off benefit, not people who can't find work, but people who have work will now suddenly find a massive reduction in their income for a series of quarters, which will be very difficult for them to cope with. This has been a supply shock. It's different maybe from other crises like the 2008-9, which, as Joseph described to us, was the result of a falling inability to sustain investment and profitability, and a massive increase in credit boom, leading to a speculative bubble which burst and crashed. So you could say it was a financial crash that triggered it. This time it's a straightforward supply shock, not an exogenous one, as I'll explain, but as this little diagram shows, we can see that the supply shock leads to the fall in jobs and incomes. That leads to a fall in demand, incomes, and people can't buy anything because they're stuck at home or they haven't got any income anymore. This leads to a collapse in the financial sector as well, and forces governments to act either with fiscal or monetary measures, which now various governments are attempting to do. So we've got a supply shock, but the word shock is a mainstream economics term. It's one they love to use. Everything is fine, nothing's going wrong, the capitalist economy is fine, then it gets the occasional shock from outside. But this was no shock, this was no surprise. In my view, the virus, if it hadn't been a virus which triggered this slump, then it would have been something else, a collapse in the corporate sector, in debt and so on, because the world economies were already slowing down fast, profitability was dropping away. So this is like a tipping point. The last bit of sand on the pile begins the avalanche. On this occasion, it's a coronavirus that has tipped the point. And that beneath this appearance of just some shock is the fact that profitability in the world economies, as Joseph said, is in a seriously low level. If we look at just this figure since 1950, for the rate of return on capital in the major economies, you can see that we're pretty close to the lows. The low was perhaps in the mid-1980s, but we're way, way lower than we were back in the 1950s and 60s. That makes it extremely difficult for capitalism to continue to develop. The forces improve employment, incomes and investment, and so any trigger that causes a recession is very quickly felt in the capitalist economy. Indeed, in my view, capitalism was heading towards a recession because the overall profit levels in most of the economies, I've got a measure here of global profits, was heading down towards zero and below just before the virus started. Before the virus hit the world economies in 2020, we were already back into negative territory on corporate profits. So that beneath this apparent trigger, this shock, lies an underlying contradiction, underlying failure of capitalism to develop, because capitalism only develops if it makes a profit and if there's profitability. That's the basis of capitalist production. And if profitability isn't there and profits are going negative, then you will see a slump and a crash eventually. Behind that also, as Joseph pointed out, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's been a massive increase in the amount of debt that corporations have built up relative to the revenues that they've been making or exploiting from workers. Because profitability has been low and productive investment doesn't look good, they've borrowed more and more money to sustain their companies. They've used so much of that debt to buy back their own shares, particularly in America and Europe, in order to boost the share price and therefore keep the stock market investing in their companies and providing the support that they require. But this is a fictitious way of developing an economy, basing it on debt, not on productive assets, producing more value, but just simply piling more paper money on top of more paper money in order to keep companies going. And the corporate debt has reached a very high level. And in particular, the sort of corporate debt you get, as you can see in the graph in the middle there, BB plus and BB, these are areas which are the most risky sort of bonds which companies have issued. The most safe bonds, which are the AAAs on the left-hand side, hardly any have been issued there. Most companies are in risky areas, issuing bonds in order to sustain themselves and therefore placing themselves in a very dangerous position with a level of debt. $1 trillion in very risky bonds now exist at the current moment. And if those cannot be serviced, then we're going to see a cascade of corporate bankruptcies over the next year. The other big double whammy which has come across in the middle of this virus is the collapse in the oil price. The competition between Saudis and Russia in order to control the oil market and the collapse in demand for oil and energy over the last year or so has led to a massive competition between these two oil powers, and they've drastically cut the oil price or boosted the production in competition with each other. So the control of the oil price has collapsed, and it's gone down from, as you can see, around about $55 just at the beginning of this year to 20 or even below at the moment. That is catastrophically hitting the revenues, not just of the big energy countries around the world and the energy companies, but also it reflects what's happening in industrial metals and other commodities where there have been similar collapses. the so-called emerging economies, the peripheral countries of the world dominated by imperialism, which rely very much on staples like this, commodity staples and expanding agriculture, industrial minerals, and so on. Their exports are collapsing. The value of their currencies is collapsing. Therefore, the debt that they've been building up in dollar terms is rising fast, so that we see a position here, for example, where growth, the red line, is slowing down over the last 10 years, and the debt for emerging market debt is rising and passing by the growth in GDP. And now we have this slump in prices. This is going to mean that not just the hit to those of us living in the so-called advanced economies or imperialist countries are going to suffer, working people here, but that's going to be a double hit for the billions of people who live in these other countries, dependent upon exports to the advanced economies and in no position to get any sort of social safety net to protect them against this slump. The battle, as Joseph said, is really between the desire of the capitalist economies to keep on growing and their authorities and the health of the population. This is a little graph, a little bit complicated, but the top half of the graph shows that the idea of the lockdown, of containment policies is to stop the peak, that red curve at the top, reaching the peak of cases which the health services cannot manage, and to flatten the curve, as they say, so it comes later and is not so damaging to the health service, it can be coped with. But if you flatten the curve on the top line for health, you deepen the curve of the recession, the blue line below in the second half of the graph for the capitalist economies. So there is a conflict here between those in the ruling capitalist groups who want to sustain the capitalist economy at the expense of our health, like Mr. Trump, who wants to go back to full business as usual by Easter Sunday after the church service, and then those who see the need to try and sustain the interests of working people and their public health, even if it means a collapse of the economy. Capitalism cannot provide both a decent health outcome and a decent economy. The two things are now in severe conflict. When asked about the question of why there hasn't been enough testing in the US and why there's been no spending and investment in finding vaccines in advance to deal with this, the Secretary of Health in the US said, well, we have to work to make it affordable for the private sector. We can't control the price because it's up to the private sector to invest. And that's the issue. As far as they're concerned, if the private sector, the big pharma companies don't want to invest in vaccines, in testing, in all these sorts of new diseases which are hitting us, prefer to work in various things which make it profitable for them, then there is no help, no protection from these pandemics. We're going to get more of them if we continue with a health system around the world and pharmaceutical companies dominated by the need for profit and capitalist companies. So as Joseph said, there's been a huge bailout. This is going to continue. We've seen lots now of public spending, even the US package this week, $2 trillion, sounds a lot of dollars. It will need, on the basis of every month being $2 trillion or more being lost by the US economy, $2 trillion is not going to last long. But of that $2 trillion, 2/3 was just to bail out the big companies with straight handouts and grants and loans to small businesses, and only 1/3 to giving some sort of income for working people to survive during the period of the lockdown in the US, however long that lasts. In the UK, pretty much a similar ratio, huge amounts of bailouts, loan guarantees to the banks and to companies, and also now grants to various travel companies and so on. And yet what appears to be a big increase in unemployment benefit to 80% of wages for employees and even for self-employed. I'd have to point out for those of you in the UK that actually 80% of wages as unemployment benefit is pretty much an average or norm throughout most of Northern Europe. It's only the UK that has such an incredibly low level of unemployment benefit. And this benefit announced by the government is only there for 2 months. And in the case of the US, it's not even going to be paid until June. So people are going to really be suffering over the next 2 months. All those people who are even going to get this money will have to wait for it, and there are many millions who will get nothing at all. I was going to say something about arms, but I'll skip that because I want to talk about what about international coordination? What are governments going to do to organize, to stop the pandemic, to provide the funding that protects the world, particularly the emerging market world, who have no funds and resources to avoid this pandemic? Will there be cooperation? Well, G20 had a meeting like we've just had now over Zoom last few days ago, and they rejected the idea of extra emergency funding to be given to the IMF in order to distribute to the members of the IMF around the world. The Eurozone had a video call too, and they rejected the idea of having an Eurozone-wide bond, a fund that could be used to help countries like Italy and Spain who are running out of funds in order to meet the health epidemic which exists there. They rejected that because they didn't want to put money into Italy, which the Germans might not see again. And Trump has made no step towards reducing the tariff or technology war that he's conducting with China. In fact, he's been tightening that over the past few weeks quietly without you noticing. More sanctions on Iran, more sanctions on Venezuela, more sanctions than any country which has been stepping out of line as far as the US is concerned. So there is no international coordination taking place to resolve or reduce the impact of this pandemic and the lockdown. On the contrary, we are seeing an increasing tension between the big powers about how to solve this issue, and every man or woman for themselves in country terms is the situation now. So what are the lessons on this, viewers, which I want to finish on? The immediate lessons we've got now that are already clear to us. The first one, as Joseph has pointed out, that it's capitalism that's generating these crises, not just this one, but others, not nature as such, through our environmental pollution, industrial farming, the climate change, don't forget that that is still a major issue before us, and now the pandemics. This is a product of the commodification of nature, of the failure to control and environmental pollution, the uncontrolled expansion of fossil fuel industry, and so on. The market is not working. The market has failed to protect us from this COVID epidemic. It's run down, privatized, and cut the health service to the ribbons, and it has not allowed any investment in things that are needed to help epidemics, people suffering from all the sorts of epidemics around the world, through medical prevention, through new drugs and so on, until the crisis hit us. And there's nothing about the climate crisis, which is heading our way over the next couple of decades. That situation demonstrates, if anything, this pandemic demonstrates that capitalism and the market is not going to avoid help us with these crises. It's also exposed that it's those workers whose jobs are most undervalued by the system whom we most rely on. It is not the financiers, it is not the billionaires. It's the people working in the health service, the school people, people keeping our basic services going. These are the people who've had their incomes and their conditions and everything cut to shreds in the last 10 to 15 years. And yet these are the people that we have now to turn to in order to keep us, many of us, alive and healthy, and also to enable us to at least have some semblance of reasonable conditions in these lockdowns that are taking place now. I mean, it is so obvious, is it not, viewers, that we need internationally free public healthcare, a mass public investment in research and the production of medicines and vaccines. How can that not be obvious? Even in countries like the United States, who spend twice as much on health as a percentage of GDP than we do in Europe, and yet they have one of the poorest outcomes in terms of life expectancy and other health outcomes. Clearly, this private run, for-profit healthcare system and investment is not working and is actually damaging and creating conditions for increasing the impact of this pandemic. It must be the main conclusion we reach from this crisis is that a socialized economy, democratically run and internationally coordinated, is the only way in which we can reduce the impact of this, reverse the damage that we're doing to nature and the way that nature is now hitting back to us, to end the climate crisis and bring the planet back into a harmony with human production, and above all, provide us with a decent living and a prospect for a better future. Here we are in the dark positions of a lockdown, but I think those are the lessons that we can already draw on what has happened so far.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Michael. So now, just to make it clear to all of the viewers, we're going to have 2 rounds of questions. Thank you so much for commenting underneath. There's been some really, really brilliant questions. What we've done is that we've kind of picked out about 3 for each round, which we think kind of sum up the mood of the comments and are the best expressed questions, or maybe not best expressed, but there are certain ones that we've selected. So I hope both speakers have got a pen and paper nearby. I'm going to read all 3 questions in succession, and then each speaker will have 5 to 7 minutes in order to answer them. So the first question is from Fran, and she asks, what are the implications of the crisis for inter-imperialist rivalry? Tensions have already been building between China and the US, for instance. The second question is from Tony. Tony asks, will the economic crisis and slump offer capitalism the opportunity to destroy a sufficient amount of weak and out-of-date businesses and deepen the strength of monopolies to rebuild into a fresh period of growth? And the final question for the first round is from Richard, and Richard asks, government debt will now be enormous while the world economy goes into recession. Will we see the sort of sovereign debt crisis we saw after 2008? So if it's okay with both speakers, we're going to go to Michael first, as he spoke second. You've got between 5 and 7 minutes. When you've had 5, I'll notify you somehow. So back over to you, Michael. Hopefully you've got all the questions.
Questions, 3 excellent questions from our viewers. Obviously, people are pretty au fait with what's been happening and are already thinking about some of the more difficult questions to answer. Well, as I said, one of the points that I made, international rivalry is more likely than international coordination at the moment. And before this virus broke on us, we already were considerably worried about the development of a trade and technology war between China and the US. The US has been the hegemonic economic, political, and military power since the Second World War without much opposition, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 1980s. But it's also been in relative decline economically in that period, and we've seen the rise of other capitalist powers to some extent, Japan, Europe as well. But perhaps the most important development has been the rise of China since the 1980s and onwards, and particularly since 2000, so that it has now become the major manufacturing power in the world, and it's increased its share of world production from a mere 3 or 4% back in the 80s now to 15, 17% of GDP, closely rivaling now in terms of output the United States. And above all, the most serious development for the United States is beginning not just to take in technology from the rest of the world and assemble it and use it to produce manufactures, but develop its own high-tech technology and be in a position to rival the most high-valued areas of technology with the US, Europe, and Japan. That it really frightens the US imperialist leaders, who see this as the challenge which they can and must resist. If you listen to the speeches made during this crisis, it's been about the Chinese virus. It's been about the fact that the Chinese are caused the crisis by being delaying it, and the Chinese are now not cooperating. It is all attempts now to drive the blame on China, but also to increase the tensions. And we're going to see a lot more of this. This is the position over the next decade or so that we can find. And that means that I think the second question is also very, very important. I'm not sure I can answer it clearly. The question is, to remind viewers, is that if capitalism goes into a slump, will this mean the collapse of loads of companies, small companies, who will be cleansed out? The zombie companies that Joseph talked about will be cleansed by the slump. This lays the basis for the larger companies to take them over, to use their resources and to boost their own profitability, as it were, to become leaner and meaner. And that is the sort of change that you'd expect in normal slumps and crises. That's how capitalism revives itself. It wipes out the old wood, sets itself up again. By the way, while it's wiping it out, it's also wiping out our jobs and our livelihoods over a period of 2 years or however long it takes. And then it creates the conditions for what, to use a phrase, what Marx called all the old crap all over again. And then we get the development of a new capitalist boom period. That is certainly a possibility that comes out of this. It cannot be ruled out. All I would say is that it's much more difficult now, much more difficult than it was before. Profitability remains low. It's going to take a huge destruction of capital values to boost profitability. And every time we have a new boom, it seems to be weaker than the last. I'm not entirely convinced that the next one, which could well come, will be sufficiently strong to really transform and provide the support capitalist production needs. Because, as has been pointed out, we're going to have a huge increase in debt, which is going to weigh down on the capitalist economy. Yes, a lot of that will be sovereign debt, and no doubt the capitalists will want to avoid paying for that back. They will either try to print more money to cover it, or they will try to shift the burden of paying that debt down onto workers, as they did last time with increased taxes and cuts and more austerity. So although we see something, I saw, just to finish, Chair, I saw a remark in the local paper, in The Guardian, by Will Hutton, who said, well, this shows that we're all become Keynesians now. It's the end of austerity and everything is now, the governments are looking to spend money like nobody's business. Well, they may be for 2 quarters, but I can assure you, if we get to the position where debts are high again, and the corporate sector has got heavy debts on, they'll be looking to shift the burden of repaying that debt and serving that debt back onto us.
Yes, thank you. I agree with a lot of the points Michael Roberts made, so I'll try not to repeat him too much. I think it's important to say that there can be an explosion of government debt in this period, and we know from the experience of 2008, 2009, that what tends to happen in these conditions is that bond market traders tend to target the most vulnerable states, attack their bond markets, push up interest rates and drive them to the brink of bankruptcy. We saw that in Greece, in the Spanish state and so on, back in the last crisis. And there's no reason to believe that this won't follow a similar pattern. But I suspect that this will be a much more generalized crisis of sovereign debt if that does emerge. It won't simply be focused on the Eurozone, it will be much, much wider than that. Second, inter-imperialist tensions aren't going anywhere in this crisis. There's a reason why Donald Trump's response is to talk about the China virus and shut the borders. This crisis will see an intensification of all the antagonisms at the top of international capitalist society as different ruling classes try to shift the burden of who pays the price for this crisis. That's what we should expect in a capitalist global order. And that involves everything from shifting the economic burden to states selectively using aid to help their allies and punish their enemies, and so on. And we see, Michael Roberts talked about it, the ridiculous, irrational decision of Saudi Arabia and Russia to launch an oil price war amidst this already catastrophic crisis. So there's very clear evidence that ruling classes around the world will put their own narrow capitalist interest before the interest of trying to deal with it with this crisis. So I think we'll see more tensions within the global system at an international level. On the second question of will the economic crisis give the capitalists a chance to clear out their system and pave the way for a rebound in profitability, very hard to say, but I think one thing we can say is if you look at the history of 20th and 21st century capitalism, more and more it's become difficult for crisis to do its job of clearing out unprofitable firms. And part of the reason for that is the structure of capitalism has changed. We face a world now of not small companies, but giant multinational firms, increasingly bound together with financial markets and increasingly bound together with their own states. Allowing one of these giant capitalist firms to go under and create a black hole at the center of the economy is far more perilous for ruling classes. And so again and again, throughout that period, the temptation for ruling classes has been to bail out the system and to try and stop these giant firms going under. I suspect that in this current crisis, the temptation will be the same. Whether they manage to do that is an open question. That the crisis may go on too big a scale, and therefore we may see a much more cataclysmic slump than we did in 2008, 2009, with the possibility of some sort of rebound if we live to see the other side of that crisis. And here we have to say, these are not the only options. The choice isn't between a long period of capitalist stagnation and a horrendous slump which kills millions of people and then a rebound in profitability. There's a third choice, which is that working class people take matters into their own hands and impose a working class solution. And by way of conclusion, I think it's very important to say that before the outbreak of the coronavirus in 2019, what we were seeing around the world was a rise of global rebellion by workers. There were revolutions in Algeria and Sudan last year. There were major outbreaks of class struggle in Chile, in Catalonia, in France, and more generally. And we have to try to nurture these signs of working class people fighting back collectively to impose a working class and socialist solution.
Thanks very much for that, Michael. Joseph. Michael and Joseph are both very succinct, so it means hopefully we'll be able to squeeze one more question in for the second round. Just before I ask our final round of questions, we've had a comment from Margaret. Margaret says, "I'm getting ready here in Ireland for the political battles, ahead afterwards. We have changed and will continue to change, and we'll have no more of the same." So thanks for that, Margaret. I'm sure we can echo that in the UK as well as in Ireland. So here are the 4 questions. Hopefully both speakers are listening. Fatima asks, what does this mean for policies of austerity post-COVID-19? Julie has asked us, how do we concretely oppose the, quote, "we are all in this together," unquote, mantra that is coming from the top but being circulated widely? Our third question is from Salma. Salma's coming from France. She says, "Hi, I am from France and the social tension is very high among the workers. How can we argue for a socialist project now that the ruling classes and the president himself are taking a neo-Keynesian turn?" And finally, our final question, hopefully if both speakers are ready, because they're quite similar, we can squeeze in 4. Tom asks, after 2008 to 2009, workers were made to pay for the crisis. What can we do to make sure workers aren't forced to pay? And are there any examples of struggle already? So hopefully both our speakers have got that. Once again, apologies for technical difficulties. Hopefully it will be better this time round. And I'll bring it back to Michael, same amount of time again, 5 to 7 minutes.
Important question. Are we going to end up with, as Fedora says, another round of austerity after this lockdown and slump is over? I think that is a very likely development. It's partly relevant also to the question from France that we have a neo-Keynesian policy being adopted by Macron, by the Johnson government in the UK, even the US Congress and even Germany has launched a massive fiscal program in order presumably to help business and to some extent the working people in Germany. So does this mean that neo-Keynesianism is now the order of the day and that austerity is going to disappear? Well, my answer would be probably, as far as I can see at the moment, we shall first have neo-Keynesianism. We shall have some spending. Most of that spending, whether it's actual cash spending or whether it's simply loans and grants and various other credit guarantees, will be to getting capitalism in shape, keeping big business going, getting the airlines functioning, agreeing to Virgin Atlantic's Branson's demand for huge amounts of billions of cash, for the US airlines demanding they should have billions of cash, having spent billions of cash buying back their own shares previously from the profits produced from their workers in order to boost their shares. Instead of using it for a rainy day like this, they have now want the money from the government. So we're going to get a lot of spending from governments to keep big business in shape, to some extent to try and save some of the small businesses, because that affects millions and millions of people, and to a limited extent to try and tide workers over who are unemployed during the lockdown and the closures of work. But once that's over, and once we move into the period of some sort of recovery, and the economies start to come back to so-called normal, and the damage is there, the huge amounts of debt that's been built up, the budget deficits and so on, plus a number of companies still struggling to make ends meet, I think we'll then be in a situation where it'll be the governments will change their attitude and we'll go back to the aims of trying to make capitalism work by reducing its costs at the expense of workers and their own social wage, which is public services and all the health and so on. It's going to be very difficult for the governments to do that because people can now see that they need a fully funded health service around the world. They can now see that they need fully funded public services of other sorts. The idea that these should be trimmed again and cut back again because capitalism's got big deficits to pay on public sector debt is something I think is going to be very difficult for them to apply, but they will try it. And the question of how do we answer, we're all in this together? Well, I think that's pretty been part of what the discussion that we've been saying, the point I'm making, that this crisis is not a fault of workers around the world. It's not a fault of people engaging in farming and agriculture. It's the fault of a capitalist industrialized system, and it's a fault of a capitalist system that cannot produce anything without profitability. And now, we're not in this altogether because it seems that although governments are really spending their time trying to bail out big business, the banks and the travel companies and all the other people who have been hit, and only just letting workers having a little bit to add to workers. And it's all workers who are out there protecting us from this pandemic, in the hospitals, in the public services, in the essential services. It's not big business. They've all flown off to God knows where in various islands that they own in order to sit there and wait for the pandemic to disappear. We're not all in this together. They've gone and we're left to try and clear up the process. And so at the end of the day, we're going to have to, there'll be a battle between who's going to pay for the mess that's afterwards. And that's where the political struggle will develop. I don't expect a political struggle now that we're in lockdown. But once that's over and recovery takes place, that is when the battle will become between who's going to pay for this, who's going to sort it out, and what sort of economy and society do we want now, from now on, which will ensure that we don't get into the situation where millions are thrown out of work and millions could well die through the process of pandemics and other crises ahead. That's the issue before us, and that will be the issue which will ignite the struggle and the class struggle over the next 2 or 3 years.
Thank you. And before I sort of come back on points, just to say that it's well worth people looking both on Michael Roberts's blog, which I think you can find in the Facebook group, and you can read International Socialism, where I've written an article, Socialist Review, The Socialist Worker, if you want to find out more information about the kind of arguments we've been making. Now, in terms of the questions, examples of struggle, there are lots of examples of struggle. Most dramatically, probably in Italy and France, but they're more general than that. And part of the reason why there's been struggle is if you look at a capitalist society, the single biggest concentration of people is the workplace. And where states haven't shut workplaces down, there have been battles by workers to enforce this. If you look at Britain today, something like 50% of the workforce in Britain are in workplaces of 100 plus people. And so this has been a major point of tension. If you look at the case of Italy, strikes took place in the Fiat plant in Termoli and near Naples, in car component manufacturers near Florence, in the shipyards in Venice, in the docks in Genoa, in steelworks, in clothing plants, and so on. There's been a whole wave of class struggle as people have fought to enforce what I call social distancing from below. In other words, the bosses won't shut down the workplaces, we'll shut them down for them. Similar patterns in France. And even in Britain, where there was a walkout in libraries in South London, 10 libraries were shut down by workers' activities. So even in these conditions, there can be elements of class struggle that develop. Second point I want to come back on is this idea that we're all in it together. I thought it was wonderful on Thursday night that everyone came out into my street to clap for the NHS workers. Fantastic sign of solidarity, the appreciation that people have for the NHS workers. We should extend that, I think, as well to the oft times in normal capitalism, elected, treated like crap on 0 hours contracts, on lousy wages, in horribly oppressive conditions, who suddenly seem to be essential to the functioning of capitalist society. But I think it's also important to say that Boris Johnson himself was clapping for the NHS workers, and he wanted to think that we're all in it together. And we have to say holistic interests between the rich and the poor, between bosses and workers. The super rich can jet off in their private jets with their private physicians and hide for the duration of the crisis. If you're Prince Charles or you're Boris Johnson, you can get instantly tested the moment you display symptoms. If you're a frontline health worker, up until now, tests have been impossible. And at every stage, as I've shown, Boris Johnson has dragged his feet in implementing the basic health and safety measures to protect working class lives. So we shouldn't accept the lie that there is a common interest here. And there's a more general point I want to finish on, which is that a crisis like this, it doesn't suspend the antagonisms of capitalist society, it intensifies the antagonisms of capitalist society. Whether that's inter-imperialist rivalries, whether that's the crisis tendencies of capitalism, or whether that's the class antagonisms of the capitalist system, all of these tensions will be intensified in the coming months. And the longer this crisis lasts, the more people are going to recognize the presence of these antagonisms in society. I think the job for us on the left is to focus those antagonisms and to try to argue for a socialist, democratic, and sustainable solution to the problems thrown up by capitalism, and ultimately begin to challenge this barbaric system that generates these crises, and when they come along, finds itself ill-prepared and incapable of responding to them. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Joseph, and to you, Michael, for those very succinct answers. I know I certainly learned a lot in the last hour. So unfortunately, that's all we have time for. This marks the end of our live Facebook stream this evening. I'd just like to say again a final thank you to everyone who tuned in, those who asked questions, and also another thank you to our speakers, both Michael and Joseph. I'd just like to leave you with a couple of final announcements and reminders. Firstly, like I said, both speakers are authors of some fabulous books, which you can access from Bookmarks Bookshop at www.bookmarksbookshop.co.uk. Obviously, in this time, small businesses and independent bookshops are really suffering at the moment. Bookmarks is a really brilliant place, so please do check out their website and donate or buy a book from them. Secondly, you can still reach us on the hashtag Health Before Profit. Please tweet out and contact us that way. And finally, if you enjoyed what you heard tonight and you're looking for answers in this very unstable and unsettling time, then please think about joining the Socialist Workers' Party. We've got socialists in every area all over the country, and if you're looking for something to get involved in, our doors are open. We're really welcome to have you all. So we've got a link to join us on the website, which will be posted in the event description in this event. And lastly, like I said, the event's going to be on YouTube very shortly, so you can review it again and share it. And I'll leave you all by saying, please keep posted on the page. We'll hopefully got a lot more interesting videos coming up in the future. And with that, I'll say solidarity to everybody who watched. Stay safe and stay socialist. So thank you. Good evening.